The room around you is still dark, but the darkness has begun to thin, the way it does just before dawn when the air itself seems to loosen, and you wake not with a start, but with a slow coming to awareness. Your body heavy on the sleeping mat, the linen sheet twisted lightly around your ankles. The walls of the house are mud brick, and they hold the coolness of the night, a dry coolness that feels smooth against your skin. And from somewhere outside you can hear the first bird, a single call that repeats in the distance and then goes quiet. You lie still for a moment longer, looking up at the palm log ceiling where the shadows are soft and blurred, and you let the day arrive in its own time. The smell of the room is the smell of dried reeds from the mat beneath you, of old wood from the chest in the corner, of the river that is never far away and that always leaves its scent in the air like a faint greenness. You sit up slowly, the straw of the mat crackling under your movement, and you rub your eyes with the heels of your hands until the sleepiness begins to fade. You stand and the packed earth floor is cool under your bare feet, a compacted surface smoothed by years of walking, and you cross the small room to where your scribble kit waits on a low wooden stool. The kit is familiar, and everything in it has its place. A wooden palette, rectangular and worn at the edges from the press of your thumb, holds two shallow hollows where the ink cakes sit, one cake of black soot ink and one of red ochre, both dried hard and waiting for water. Next to the palette is a small clay pot with a narrow neck, stoppered with a twist of linen, and inside it the water is cool from the night. The reed brushes are tied together with a scrap of cord, their ends trimmed to a fine point that you will test later, and there is a roll of fresh papyrus bound with a linen tie, the outer layer slightly dusty, but the inside smooth and pale. You pick up the palette and the water pot and the brushes and the papyrus, gathering them into a bundle that fits neatly under your arm, the weight of it a comfort, because it is the weight of every morning you can remember. You turn toward the doorway, which is a simple opening in the mud brick wall with no door, just a woven reed mat that can be lowered for shade or privacy, but is now tied up to let the night air pass through. Stepping outside, you are met by the first grey light of the river dawn, a light that seems to rise from the water itself, spreading across the sky in bands of pale silver and the faintest hint of gold. The air is damp but not cold, cool enough to make you notice the warmth of your own skin, and it carries the mixed scents of river mud, wet papyrus stalks, the faint smoke of a distant cooking fire, and the clean green smell of the fields. You stand for a moment just outside your threshold, taking in the world as it slowly becomes visible. The path before you is raised slightly above the level of the fields, a walkway of packed earth reinforced with old potsherds and small stones, and it runs straight toward the granary compound that you cannot yet see, but that you know is there, waiting. You begin to walk, and your feet make no sound on the damp earth, the path softened by the dew that settles every night, and that soaks into the ground slowly over the morning hours. To your left, beyond a narrow strip of wild grass and low shrubs, the Nile moves in its ancient bed, a broad stretch of water the colour of pewter under the low sky. The surface is not still, but it is slow, a heavy smooth movement that catches the light in places and breaks it into 1,000 small reflections that shift and disappear. You see a heron standing in the shallows, its long legs thin as reed stems, its body perfectly still, except for the occasional twitch of its head. Farther out a fisherman's small boat drifts, the man standing at the stern with a pole, moving so slowly that he seems part of the river itself. The sound of the water is a low murmur, a constant quiet note beneath everything else, and it accompanies you as you walk. The fields on your other side are fields of stubble now, the harvest having been gathered and the earth left bare, dotted here and there with the dried stalks of cut grain. The dirt is a dark brown, almost black in the half-light, and it shows the lines of the plough from the previous season, shallow furrows that now hold little puddles of dew. A donkey stands in one of the fields, motionless, its head low, and you pass it without it raising its head. The path takes you past a small irrigation channel where the water runs shallow over a bed of smooth pebbles, making a sound like a soft whispering, and you step carefully over a wooden plank that serves as a bridge, your sandals not yet on your feet, because you prefer to carry them until the ground dries. You pass a clump of reeds taller than you, their feathery tops nodding in the slight movement of air that comes before the true sunrise, and you brush your hand against them as you go, feeling the cool dampness of their stems. The sky continues to change, the grey lifting upward as a pale gold spreads from the eastern hills that you cannot see, but that you know are there, beyond the fields and the palm groves. The gold deepens slowly into a colour like ripe wheat, and the clouds, which are few and thin, take on a faint pink at their edges. The light begins to touch the surface of the river directly, so that the whole expanse of water starts to glow, a wide band of moving bronze, and the heron lifts one foot and sets it down again, still fishing. Voices reach you from ahead, the voices of fishermen calling to one another in low tones that carry easily over the water. Words you cannot quite make out, but that have the rhythm of greeting and routine. A dog barks once from somewhere inland, the sound flat and hollow in the open air, and then the quiet returns. You keep your pace steady, a walk that you have taken so many times that your body knows it without thinking. Your feet find the firm places on the path, avoiding the spots where the mud is still soft, and your bundle of tools stays snug under your arm. You notice that the papyrus roll has warmed slightly where it touches your side, the outer layer absorbing the heat of your body, and you shift it a little so that it rests more evenly. The brushes click softly against the palette with the movement, a small wooden sound, and the water in the clay pot makes a gentle slosh that is almost inaudible. You think of nothing in particular, letting the walk be what it is, a space of time between sleeping and working that belongs only to the morning. A bit farther along, the path rises slightly to pass over a low embankment built to keep the floodwaters from the houses, and from here you can see the granary compound for the first time. It is a collection of low mud brick buildings surrounded by a wall of the same material, the top of the wall uneven and worn by rain that falls rarely but with force. 2 sycamore trees grow inside the compound, their branches spreading wide and casting deep shadows that even now in the early light are dark and cool-looking. Smoke rises from somewhere behind the wall, a thin grey column that bends with the breeze and then straightens, the remains of the night's watch fire being doused. You can see the shapes of men moving slowly inside the compound, porters who have arrived before you, their white kilts pale against the brown of the walls. They walk without hurry, one figure passing something to another, and the quiet of the place is a settled quiet, a working quiet that has not yet begun in earnest. You descend from the embankment and the path levels out again, now running between 2 plots of land where onions were once planted, their dried tops still visible in neat rows, and you smell the faint sharpness of the old plants mixed with the earth. A small lizard skitters off the path as you approach, vanishing into a crack in the dry ground, and you do not break your stride. The gate of the granary compound is open, simply a gap in the wall, with two thick wooden posts on either side, and you pass through it and into the courtyard. The ground here is packed hard and swept clean, with a scattering of chaff near the large storage pits, and the air inside the compound is slightly warmer than the air by the river, held by the walls and the sun that will soon reach over them. You choose your place, as you always do, on a woven reed mat that lies in the shade of the sycamore tree closest to the granary entrance. The mat is old, and its edges are frayed, but it is thick enough to keep the ground's dampness from reaching you, and you sit down cross-legged, arranging your limbs with the ease of long habit. You place your water jar on the ground to your right, where it will be within reach, but not where you will knock it over, and you set the pallet across your knees. The papyrus roll you lay on the mat before you, still tied, and you find a smooth river stone that someone left by the tree root and set it on one end of the roll so that the papyrus will not spring shut. Then you sit for a moment doing nothing, feeling the shade settle over you like a second coolness. You untie the linen cord from the papyrus roll and begin to unroll it, slowly, carefully, because the material is fragile at the edges. The first part of the scroll shows the ruled lines from the day before, faint red ink marking the columns into neat vertical strips, and inside those columns the hieratic signs of yesterday's counts are still dark and clear. You scan them without really reading, just letting your eyes pass over the familiar shapes, the signs for emmer, for barley, for the estate names, the small tick marks that each stand for a single sack. Everything is in order, as you knew it would be, and you unroll a little more until you reach the blank portion of the scroll, the fresh surface where today's tallies will go. The papyrus is smooth and pale here, slightly textured, and it catches the light in a way that is pleasing to see. You take your water jar and pour a small amount into the hollow of the pallet where the black ink cake sits, just a few drops, enough to wet the surface without flooding it. The water soaks into the dried ink slowly, turning from clear to a deep dark color as it dissolves the soot and gum, and you watch the transformation, the blackness blooming outward in a small cloud and then settling. You take a brush from the bundle and dip its tip into the ink, moving it in a small circle to load the bristles evenly, and then you test the point on a broken piece of pottery that you keep for this purpose. The line it draws is clean and fine, a true black with no blurring, and the movement of the brush in your hand is a sensation as familiar as breathing. You test the brush again, this time drawing the small symbol for 1, and it comes out perfectly. You are ready. The porter who acts as tally call arrives, an older man with a shaved head and a kilt that has been washed so many times it is nearly translucent. He nods to you, a silent greeting, and you nod back. He takes his place near the gate, where he will call out the deliveries, and you shift on your mat so that you face the path the porters will take. The sun has now risen fully above the eastern ridge, though it is still hidden from you by the sycamore tree, and the light in the courtyard has become a warm amber that picks out the texture of the mud brick walls, every rough edge and every palm print left by the builders. The river gleams in the distance beyond the gate, a ribbon of brightness, and the first barge is visible now, a heavy boat poling slowly toward the unloading ramp, its deck piled with sacks marked in red and black. The morning has ended its quiet prelude, and the day's work is about to begin, but you remain still, brush in hand, the papyrus open before you, the ink ready, the cool shade holding you in its calm. The courtyard inside the granary walls is a space shaped by long use, its ground packed to a hard smoothness by countless bare feet and the daily scuff of porters' heels, and even now in the early light you can see the places where the earth has been worn down into shallow hollows, the traffic patterns of years made visible. Loose chaff from the winnowing drifts into small heaps against the base of the walls, pale gold flecks that stir when a breeze passes, lifting and settling again in a soft, intermittent dance. The two sycamore trees stand in the center of the open area, their trunks wide and gnarled, bark peeling in places to show the pale wood beneath, and their broad leaves overlap so densely that the shade beneath them is a single dark pool that barely moves even when the upper branches sway. Under this canopy the air is noticeably cooler, a dry, still coolness that holds the scent of earth and old wood, and a faint sweetness from the tree itself. A few porters are already moving about, their white kilts catching the light as they cross the sunny patches between the shadows, their movements slow and without hurry, one man pausing to adjust the strap of a carrying pole, another crouching to check the cord on a basket. They speak to each other in low voices that do not carry far, just a murmur of words that blends into the general quiet of the morning. You walk to the sycamore closest to the granary entrance, a tree you have sat beneath so many times that the roots have formed a natural low seat to one side, and beside it someone has placed a woven reed mat that looks as though it has been there for years. The mat is thick, and its weave is beginning to come undone at the edges, little fibers curling upward, but the center is still firm and flat, and you lower yourself onto it with the care of a person settling into a familiar chair. You stretch your legs out for a moment, feeling the tension of the walk release from your calves, and then you fold them back into a cross-legged position that opens your lap as a stable surface. The ground beneath the mat is uneven in one spot where a root pushes up beneath the earth, and you shift slightly to the left so that you are not sitting directly on it. A small adjustment you make without thinking because you have made it every day for as long as you can remember. You set your clay water jar on the ground just beyond the edge of the mat, nestling it into a small depression that keeps it upright, and you place your wooden pallet across your knees where it rests with a familiar weight, its worn surface smooth against your skin. The reed brushes you unroll from their linen wrap and lay in a neat line beside your right thigh, their cut ends pointing away from you so that the ink will not stain your kilt. The roll of fresh papyrus you place on the mat before you, still tied with its cord, and you take a moment to look at it, at the way the outer layer has yellowed slightly from exposure to air, and the inner layers remain pale and untouched. You find the smooth river stone that always sits near the base of the sycamore, a dark grey oval heavy in your hand, and you set it aside for now, knowing you will need it to hold the scroll open. You lean back just a little, your spine finding the posture it will hold for the next several hours, and you let your gaze travel over the courtyard while your hands rest idle on the pallet. The granary building itself is a long, low structure of mud brick, its walls unplastered and showing the individual bricks laid in even courses, and across its front runs a narrow portico supported by thick columns made of bundled palm logs. Under this portico the overseer will soon sit on his own mat, keeping his own tally by memory, and you can see his water jar already there, a large one with a wide mouth, and a folded cloth he uses to wipe his face in the heat. The main storage pit is under the granary floor, a deep chamber lined with plastered mud, and its opening is covered by a heavy wooden hatch that now lies open to one side, a dark square in the ground. Around it the chaff is thicker, scattered from the sacks that split sometimes, and the air here smells more strongly of grain, a dry, dusty smell that is not unpleasant. Beyond the walls the river moves past, visible as a strip of shimmering light between the gateposts, and you can see the tops of papyrus plants bending slightly with the current, their umbels like small green suns. When you are ready, you untie the linen cord from the papyrus roll and begin to unroll it with both hands, turning it slowly so that the written part emerges first. The scroll unrolls with a soft crackling sound, the fibers separating from each other, and you stop when you have revealed the portion that holds yesterday's entries. The ruled columns of red ink and the black hieratic signs marching from right to left in orderly rows. You look at them not to check them, because you will do that later, but to orient yourself to the work, to see where yesterday ended and today must begin. The names of the estates are there, written in the same hand you are about to use again, and the numbers of sacks, and the small marginal note about a torn sack that lost a measure of grain, and all of it is familiar in a way that soothes the mind, the record of another day very much like this one. You place the smooth river stone on the upper edge of the scroll to keep it flat, and you unroll a little more until the blank portion appears, pale and clean and ready. You take your water jar and remove the linen stopper, and you pour a small amount of water into the hollow of the pallet where the black ink cake waits, tilting the jar slowly so that the water does not spill over the edge. The water spreads across the dried ink surface, and for a moment nothing seems to happen, the liquid just sitting there as a clear pool, and then the darkness begins to bloom from the bottom, a slow unfurling of color that rises into the water in soft clouds, black at first and then gray, swirling and settling, until the entire little hollow is filled with a deep wet ink that catches the light with a faint sheen. The smell of it reaches you, a smell of soot and gum, and something else that is simply the smell of writing, a smell you have known since you were a boy learning to hold a brush. You set the water jar down and leave the ink to fully dissolve while you select a brush. You pick up the first reed from the row beside you, a brush you have used for several days already, its tip still sharp but beginning to soften from repeated dipping. You examine it, turning it in the light, and you decide it will serve for the morning's work. So you pinch off a tiny fiber that has split from the side, and then you dip the tip into the ink, moving it in a small circle the way you always do, letting the bristles soak up the blackness evenly. Then you lift it, and on the piece of broken pottery that serves as your testing surface, you draw a single short line. The line is clean but slightly thick at the end where your hand hesitated, so you draw another line with a lighter touch, and this one is perfect, fine and even, the stroke of a trained scribe whose hand knows the weight of the brush without being told. You draw the hieratic symbol for 1, a simple mark, and then the symbol for 10, and both come out crisp, the edges sharp, the ink flowing without pooling. Satisfied, you set the brush down across the palette's edge and let the ink on the pottery shard dry. The shade under the sycamore has deepened slightly as the sun climbs, the shadow now a solid shape on the ground, and the temperature beneath it remains pleasant, while the courtyard outside the shadow begins to warm. You feel the heat on your shoulder, where a single beam of light finds a gap in the leaves, a small warm spot that you could move away from if you wanted, but you do not, because it is not yet strong enough to bother you. The porters have gathered in a loose group near the water steps, some squatting, some standing with their backs against the wall, and they talk among themselves while they wait for the barges to be fully moored. One man is eating a piece of bread, tearing it with his fingers and chewing slowly, and another is sharpening a small knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone, a steady sound that underlies the morning's quiet. The overseer has appeared now, a broad man with a shaved head and a calm expression, and he takes his place under the portico, settling onto his mat with a grunt and arranging his kilt. He looks across at you and gives a brief nod, a silent acknowledgment that you are ready, and he is ready, and the day can proceed. You nod back. Now you can see the first barge beyond the gate, a long flat vessel poled by two men standing at the stern, moving slowly against the current, with the unhurried skill of those who have done this work their whole lives. The barge is heavy in the water, its deck barely above the surface, and the sacks are stacked in careful rows, each one marked with a seal in red paint that identifies the estate from which it came. The poles dip and rise, the water dripping from them in silver strings, and the barge eases toward the unloading ramp, a slope of packed mud reinforced with stones that leads up from the river's edge to the granary gate. The porters begin to move now, still slow, still in no hurry, walking toward the ramp to form the chain that will carry the sacks up to the storage pit, their bare feet finding the familiar footholds in the mud, and you watch them with the calm of someone whose part in this work is to sit and to record, to turn the movement of grain into marks on papyrus, one column at a time. You look down at your scroll, at the empty column waiting for the first entry, and you let your right hand rest on the reed brush while you wait. The ink in the palette is still dark and ready, the brush still holds its point, the shade still holds its coolness, and the river still murmurs beyond the wall. Everything is in its place, and you're in yours, and the long quiet morning of tallying is about to begin. The first barge has now been fully moored against the unloading ramp, its hull grinding softly against the packed mud, with a low, damp sound that you feel more than hear, a vibration that travels up through the earth and into the reed mat beneath you. The vessel is broad and flat, built for cargo and not for speed, its planks worn pale by sun and water, and the sacks upon its deck are arranged in orderly rows, each one a rounded shape of coarse linen tied at the neck with twisted fibre, the fabric stained here and there with the darker patches of old grain dust. The seals painted on the sacks are visible even from your mat, bold red marks that identify the estate of origin, a stylized sheaf for one, a simple circle divided by a line for another, a crude fish for a third, all of them painted by a hand that has made the same symbols 1,000 times. The two bargemen stand on the stern, their poles held upright like staffs, and they talk quietly to the porters on the bank about the depth of the water and the condition of the ramp, their words drifting across the courtyard in fragments that you do not try to piece together because the meaning is not your concern. Your concern is the papyrus before you and the ink in your palette, and the first porter who will soon walk toward you with a sack on his shoulder. You settle the palette more securely on your knees, the wood warm now from your touch, and you check the reed brush one more time, twirling it between your fingers so that the bristles hold their point. The shade of the sycamore is still deep and cool, but the sun has begun to creep across the courtyard, and you can see the edge of the shadow retreating slowly over the packed earth, revealing a line of light that sharpens every pebble and every piece of chaff. The air has lost its early dampness and now carries the dry scent of dust raised by the porter's feet, a fine pale dust that hangs in the air and catches the sunlight, making the whole courtyard seem filled with a faint golden haze. You take a breath that tastes of that dust, and of the river beyond, a mixture of dry and green, and you let your hand rest on the blank papyrus so that you can feel the slight texture of its surface under your palm. The first porter lifts a sack from the barge, bending at the knees and heaving the weight onto his shoulder in a single smooth motion that comes from years of doing exactly this. He is a man of middle age, his arms and shoulders marked with the lean muscle of a lifetime of carrying, and he wears a simple kilt of coarse linen that is belted with a length of cord. His feet are bare and calloused, and as he walks up the ramp they make a soft padding sound, a sound so regular it becomes almost a part of the morning's quiet. He reaches the top of the ramp and turns toward the granary pit, and as he passes near your mat he calls out the estate name in a voice that has been flattened by repetition into something without rise or fall, just a statement of fact delivered to the air. The estate of the overseer of the fields, he says, and you recognize the name as one you have written many times before, a name associated with the red sheaf seal that you can now see on the sack as he passes. You dip your brush into the ink and make the first mark of the day, a small vertical stroke in the upper right of the blank column, the beginning of the tally. Beside the stroke, you write the hieratic signs for the estate, a quick series of curves and lines that your hand shapes without conscious thought, the brush moving from right to left across the papyrus with the ease of long habit. Then you note the grain type, the sign for emmer wheat, which is a small circle with a cross inside, and then the number 1, the single stroke that stands for the first sack. The ink flows smoothly and dries almost at once in the warming air, the black turning from wet shine to matte darkness in the space of a breath. You lift the brush and look up, and already the porter has reached the storage pit, and you hear the sound of the sack being opened, the coarse linen pulled apart, and then the sound of the grain pouring out, a soft continuous hiss that falls into the underground chamber and disappears, the emmer wheat cascading down into the darkness with a rustle like dry wind moving through reeds. The porter shakes the sack once to empty it completely and then folds it under his arm, walking back toward the barge along the far side of the courtyard, his shadow following him like a dark cloth. The second porter is already on the ramp, a younger man with a lighter build and a faster stride, and he calls out the same estate name because the first sack was only one of many from the same holding. The estate of the overseer of the fields, he says, his voice nearly identical in its flatness, and you make a second stroke beside the first, grouping the marks together in the column so that at the end of the delivery you will be able to see at a glance how many sacks came from that place. The brush moves in the same small arc, the tip touching the papyrus, lifting, touching again, a rhythm that your hand finds easily and holds. The second sack is poured and the hissing sound repeats, the same soft fall of grain into the pit, and the dust that rises from the opening is a little thicker now, a fine brown cloud that smells of wheat husks and dry earth, and it settles on your knee in a thin layer that you do not brush away because you know it will only return. And so the morning begins in earnest. The porters form an unhurried chain, each one walking up the ramp with a sack, calling the estate name, passing your mat, emptying the grain, and returning to the barge with the empty sack folded over an arm or a shoulder, and each time this happens, you make a mark on the papyrus. The marks accumulate in the column, a series of short vertical strokes that begin to form a neat row, and beside them the estate name stands at the top of the group, written once for the whole delivery. Sometimes the estate changes, and a new voice calls out a different name, the estate of the Southern Canal or the fields of the Temple of Sobek, and you begin a new group of marks under a new heading, the brush moving to a fresh line on the papyrus, the column growing downward inch by inch. The names themselves become a kind of song in your mind, a slow repetition of places you have never seen, but that you know through these deliveries, through the grain they send and the seals they use, and the porters who speak their names in the same unvarying tones. The sun climbs higher, and the patch of shade under the sycamore shifts, narrowing at the edges, and you adjust your position slightly, moving your mat a handspan to the left so that you remain in the cool darkness. The heat outside the shade is now a visible thing, a shimmer over the courtyard wall, and the dust in the air catches the light so that the whole scene seems to be seen through a golden veil. The porters sweat, their bare shoulders glistening, and they pause at the water jar to drink, dipping a cup and tilting their heads back, the water running down their chins, before returning to the chain without a word. You drink from your own jar, the water still cool and tasting of clay, and you set it down again, the brief pause a small refreshment that makes the next tally feel a little easier. Your hand does not tire because the movements are so small and so regular, the muscles of your fingers and wrist working in a gentle, continuous pattern that asks very little of you. The sound of the grain pouring into the pit becomes a background texture, a constant soft rustle that is punctuated by the calls of the porters and the padding of their feet. And beneath it all, the river continues its own sound, a low murmur that never stops. You begin to notice smaller details as the morning wears on, the way one porter always adjusts the sack on his left shoulder before he starts up the ramp, the way another has a slight limp that makes his footsteps uneven, the way the grain dust settles more thickly on your right knee because that is the side the porters pass closest to. You notice the slight variations in the sacks themselves, some woven more tightly than others, some marked with older seals that have faded almost to nothing, and you begin to judge the weight of each delivery not by any formal measure but by the way the porter carries it, a heavier sack making him lean forward just a little more, his steps a little slower, and you note this in your record with a small mark that indicates a full sack or a slightly underweight one, a detail the overseer will appreciate later when the totals are checked. The emmer wheat itself is a grain you know well, small and hard and golden brown, with a pointed end and a groove down one side, and as the sacks are emptied, you sometimes see a few grains spill onto the ground near the pit where they lie scattered among the chaff and the dust. The sparrows that live in the sycamore tree have learned to watch for these moments, and they flutter down in brief nervous dashes, pecking at the grains, and then flying back up into the branches with a whir of wings, their small chirps adding a high bright note to the morning's low sounds. You watch them for a moment, the brush suspended in your fingers, and then you return to the papyrus and make another mark, another stroke, the column growing longer by one more line. The overseer sits under his portico and watches the same scene with the same calm, his eyes moving from the porters to the pit to you and back again, a slow circuit that he repeats at intervals. He does not speak, except to occasionally call out a correction if a sack is placed in the wrong pile, or if a porter takes too long. But these interruptions are rare and mild, a simple word or two that changes nothing about the rhythm of the work. Mostly he just sits, his hands folded on his stomach, his water jar beside him, and you have the sense that he is counting in his own way, keeping a mental tally that will later be compared to yours, a second record that lives only in his memory, and that he will recite back to you in a low chant when the deliveries pause. For now, though, there is only the slow stream of sacks from the barge, the calling of names, the hissing of grain, the small strokes of your brush. The column before you has grown to 20 marks from the first estate, and you draw a short horizontal line under the group to separate it from the next, a small bit of order that pleases you. The next delivery is from the temple fields, and the porter calls out the name in a voice that is slightly higher than the others, and you write the name and begin a new set of strokes, each one identical to the last, but each one a record of a particular sack that has passed your mat and been emptied into the pit. The ink in your palette has begun to thicken slightly from evaporation, and you add a few more drops of water from your jar, stirring the black liquid with the tip of a spare brush until it is fluid again, and then you continue, the fresh ink flowing a little faster and making a slightly darker line, a subtle change that only you would notice. The morning has become a single unbroken thing, a stretch of time measured not in hours but in sacks and marks, and you settle into it the way the river settles into its bed, moving without effort, carrying the work forward with a quiet, steady patience. The sun climbs above the outermost branches of the sycamore tree in a slow arc that you do not notice until suddenly the shadow has shrunk to a narrow pool around your mat, the edges of the cool darkness now close enough that you could touch them with your outstretched fingers. The light outside the shade is a solid wall of amber brightness, and the heat it carries is no longer a gentle warmth, but a pressing presence that makes the air shimmer above the courtyard wall and turns the distant river into a band of hard silver. The dust that has hung in the air all morning now seems thicker, every particle catching the light, so that the whole granary compound looks as though it has been glazed with a thin wash of gold. And the smell of the place has shifted from the damp greenness of dawn to a dry baked earth scent, the mud bricks giving off a faint odor of clay and straw under the steady weight of the sun. The birds that chattered earlier have fallen silent, and even the sparrows that usually flit around the storage pit have retreated to the deepest shade of the leaves, their small bodies tucked into the crooks of branches where the heat cannot reach. You have been working without pause for what feels like a long, uninterrupted stretch, your brush moving from ink to papyrus and back again in a cycle so steady that you have lost count of the individual marks, and now you become aware of your hand as a separate, tired thing, the muscles of your thumb and forefinger holding a faint ache from the repeated pinching of the reed brush. The column before you has grown long and dense with tallies, the black hieratic signs marching down the papyrus in orderly groups under their estate headings, and the ink in your palette has thickened again despite the water you added, the surface beginning to develop a slight skin that you have to break each time you dip the brush. You notice that the reed itself has softened at the tip, the sharp point now slightly blunted, so that the lines you draw are a little wider than they were at the start of the morning, a difference so small that only your eye would catch it, and you make a mental note to trim the tip before the afternoon's work begins. The overseer under his portico stirs, shifting his weight on his own mat, and he raises a hand in a casual gesture that the porters see and understand at once. He does not shout or blow a whistle. He simply lifts his palm and lets it fall, and the chain of men carrying sacks, breaks apart like a rope gently loosened. The last porter to have taken a sack sets it down near the pit without emptying it, leaving it there as a marker of where the work will resume, and the others walk slowly away from the ramp, their pace no faster than it was when they were carrying, their bodies moving with the heavy slowness of men who have been laboring for hours, and who now feel the heat fully. Some head directly to the shade of the granary wall, where a narrow strip of shadow has begun to form along the base, and they sit down with their backs against the mud brick, stretching their legs out in front of them, closing their eyes. Others go to the water jar that stands near the overseer's mat, and they drink in turns, each man lifting the jar with both hands and tilting his head back, the water running over his chin and dripping onto his chest, leaving dark spots on the dusty linen of his kilt. You take this moment to set down your brush, laying it across the palette with the inked tip resting on the edge of the pottery shard so that it will not stain the wood, and you slowly uncurl your fingers from the writing position they have held. The joints protest slightly, a tiny creaking sensation that is not pain, but simply the body reminding itself of its own limits, and you look at your hand with a mild curiosity, noticing the deep indent that the reed has pressed into the side of your thumb, a groove that is pale and bloodless, and that will take a little while to fade. You rub your thumb with the fingers of your other hand, massaging the skin until the color returns, and then you flex all your fingers several times, opening and closing your fist in a slow rhythm that feels good in the same way that stretching a leg feels good after a long sit. Your palm is smudged with ink, a faint grey stain that has worked into the lines and creases, and you do not try to wipe it off because you know from experience that it will take scrubbing with sand to remove it entirely, and that it will simply return tomorrow. The water jar beside you is still cool to the touch despite the heat of the air, the thick clay having kept the morning's freshness inside, and you lift it with both hands, the weight of it familiar and reassuring. You pull the linen stopper free and set it on your knee, and then you tip the jar to your lips and drink slowly, letting the water flow into your mouth in a small steady stream that you can control. The taste is the taste of the Nile, a faint mineral siltiness that is not unpleasant, overlaid with the clean coolness of the clay vessel itself, and as the water goes down, you feel it spread through your chest in a wave of refreshment that seems to reach even to your fingertips. You lower the jar and breathe out, and for a moment you simply hold the vessel in your lap, feeling its damp surface against your palms, watching the way the light catches the few drops of water that have condensed on the outside of the clay. You reach for the small linen bundle that you brought from your house, tied with a simple knot and tucked into the shade near the tree root to keep it cool. Inside is your morning meal, a piece of flatbread folded around a strip of dried fish, and a small pinch of salt wrapped in a separate scrap of cloth. The flatbread is a little dry at the edges, but still soft in the center where it was folded, and it has the faint nutty scent of emmer flour, a smell that reminds you of the grain you have been tallying all morning. The dried fish is from the river, a long thin strip of tilapia that has been salted and left in the sun until it is leathery and dark, and its taste is intensely savory, a concentrated flavor of the water and the mud and the reeds. You eat slowly, tearing off small pieces of the bread and fish together, chewing each mouthful for a long time, your jaw working in a lazy rhythm that matches the slow pace of the midday world around you. The salt you use sparingly, just a few grains on your tongue between bites, and it sharpens the taste of everything, making the bread seem sweeter and the fish richer. While you eat, you let your gaze wander out through the open gate of the granary compound, where the Nile lies in full sunlight like a sheet of beaten bronze. The water is so bright that it hurts to look at it directly, and you squint slightly, lowering your eyelids until the glare softens. On the far bank, which is a distant line of green reeds and dark earth, you can see small figures moving, people working in the fields perhaps. Their shapes, tiny and indistinct, and the image is so far away that it seems like a painting on a temple wall, flat and still and silent. Nearer to your side, a boy is driving a donkey along the path that runs beside the river, the donkey laden with 2 empty baskets that sway with each step, and the boy carries a switch that he does not use, letting the animal find its own pace. The donkey's hooves make small puffs of dust each time they land, and the boy walks with his head down, watching the ground, his shadow a short dark shape that clings to his heels. You watch them pass, the boy and the donkey, until they disappear behind a clump of acacia trees, and then the riverbank is empty again. A small felucca drifts across your view, its triangular sails slack in the light air, the boat moving more from the current than from any wind, and the man at the tiller sits so still that he might be carved from wood. The boat slides sideways across the water, a slow diagonal drift that takes a long time to complete, and as it goes the sun catches the sail and turns it into a triangle of white fire, so bright that you have to look away for a moment. When you look back, the felucca has almost passed out of sight behind the granary wall. Only the tip of its mast still visible, and then that too is gone. The river continues its endless movement, the same water that has been flowing since the beginning of the world, and the sight of it soothes you in a way that is hard to name, a feeling of smallness and stillness inside something vast and slow. The porters under the wall have finished their own food, whatever they brought with them, and now they sit in a loose row with their shoulders touching, talking in voices so low that you cannot make out the words, just the rumble of male voices like a distant murmur. One of them is mending a strap on a carrying pole, threading a piece of cord through a hole and pulling it tight. His movements slow and precise, and another is lying on his back with one arm over his eyes, his chest rising and falling with a deep rhythm of near sleep. A third man is telling a story. You can tell by the way his hands move, tracing shapes in the air, and the others listen without interrupting, their faces relaxed and expressionless in the heat. The scene is one of complete stillness. The rest of people who have worked hard and will work again soon, and the peace of it spreads through the courtyard like the shade itself. The heat builds gently, not as a sudden wave, but as a gradual increase that you notice in small ways, the sweat beginning to bead on your forehead, the way your linen kilt feels heavier and warmer against your thighs, the slight expansion of the wooden pallet on your knees as it absorbs the warmth. The papyrus scroll has curled slightly at the edges from the dry air, and you place your spare river stone on the curling corner to hold it flat, the weight of the stone pressing the fibers down with a soft crackle. The scent of the granary has intensified, the stored grain under the hatch giving off a dry, dusty sweetness that mixes with the smell of the porter's sweat and the green scent of the sycamore leaves. And all of it together is the smell of midday in this place, a smell you have known for so long that you no longer think of it as anything but the background of your life. You finish your bread and fish, and you brush the crumbs from your lap, watching them fall onto the mat where the ants will find them later, small black ants that live in the cracks of the mud brick and that emerge whenever food appears. You take another long drink of water, this time not because you are thirsty, but because the act of drinking is pleasant. The cool liquid, a small comfort in the growing heat, and then you pour a few drops onto your palm and rub your face, the water evaporating almost instantly and leaving a brief sensation of coolness behind. You feel the tiredness of the morning settling into your body, not a heavy exhaustion, but a light, drowsy fatigue that makes your eyelids want to close, and you let them close for a moment, just for a moment, while the sounds of the courtyard wash over you. When your eyes are closed, you hear the world more clearly. The river is a constant low hiss, the sound of water moving against its banks and against the hulls of the moored boats. The sycamore leaves rustle overhead, a dry, papery sound that rises and falls with the small puffs of breeze. A dove calls from somewhere inside the granary roof, a soft cooing that repeats 3 times and then stops, and after a pause repeats again. The porters' voices are a blur of low tones, and from the village beyond the fields you hear the faint sound of a woman singing, a high, thin melody that carries a long way in the still air. You do not listen to the song so much as you let it pass through you, a thread of sound that is there and then not there, like the call of the dove or the rustle of the leaves. You open your eyes again and look down at the papyrus on your mat, the column of tallies that you have made, the neat rows of marks that represent the morning's labor. It seems strange to you, in this drowsy moment, that all those sacks of grain and all those porters' steps have been reduced to a series of small black lines on a sheet of papyrus, and yet this is the heart of your work, this transformation of weight and movement into ink and fiber. The marks are permanent now, dried into the surface of the scroll, and they will be read by someone else perhaps, some official in the capital who will never see the river or the sycamore tree, or the porters with their dusty feet, who will know this morning only as a number in a report. But you do not think about that for long, because the thought is too large for the drowsy midday, and you let it go, watching it drift away like the felucca on the river. The overseer shifts again on his mat, and you glance toward him, seeing that he has taken a piece of linen from his shoulder and is wiping his face, moving the cloth in slow circles over his bald head where the sweat shines in the light. He catches your eye and gives a small nod, the same silent communication you have shared many times, a nod that means the rest is nearly over, but not yet, you still have a few more minutes. You nod back and return your gaze to the courtyard, where the shadow of the granary wall has lengthened by a handspan, creeping outward across the packed earth as the sun continues its arc. The heat is at its peak now, the air so heavy with it that even breathing feels like taking in something solid, and the whole world seems slowed down, thickened, every sound and movement occurring at half its morning speed. You feel grateful for this break, for the chance to sit without making marks, to let your hand rest, and your eyes rest, and your mind rest, and you do not hurry toward its end. You simply sit, the palette on your knees, the papyrus held flat by the river stones, the water jar cool against your thigh, and you let the minutes pass without counting them. The dove calls again, the leaves rustle, the river flows, and you remain still in the center of all of it, a scribe at rest in the slow heat of mid-morning, waiting for the work to resume without any impatience for it to begin. The rest period ends not with a signal, but with a gradual stirring, a collective shift among the porters that begins when one man stands up and brushes the dust from the back of his kilt, and then another man does the same, and soon the whole line of them is rising from the shade of the wall, stretching their arms, rolling their shoulders, picking up the carrying poles that had lain beside them. The overseer has not called out nor raised his hand again. The work simply resumes in its own time, the rhythm of the day asserting itself after the pause like the current of the river, resuming its flow around a temporary obstruction. You watch the porters move back toward the unloading ramp, their bare feet raising small puffs of the fine dry dust that has settled during the lull, and you take your reed brush in your hand again, feeling the slight stiffness in your knuckles as you curl your fingers around the shaft. The brush is still blunted at the tip, and you remind yourself that you will trim it later, but for now it will serve, and you dip it into the ink that has thickened once more in your absence. The first barge of the morning, the one that carried the emmer wheat from the estate of the overseer of the fields, has been fully unloaded during the earlier shift, its deck now bare except for a few loose grains and a folded net, and the two bargemen have poled it away from the ramp to make room for the next vessel. This second barge is slightly smaller than the first, its hull riding a little higher in the water, and the sacks on its deck are marked with a different seal, a crude image of a barley stalk that you recognize from many previous deliveries. The barley itself is a lighter grain than emmer, its color a pale gold rather than the deeper reddish-brown of the wheat. And even from your mat you can see the difference in the way the sacks bulge, the barley grains smaller and rounder, the fabric of the sacks pulled into a different shape by their contents. A new porter is standing at the top of the ramp, a man you have not seen before today, and he calls out the name of the estate in a high nasal voice that cuts through the courtyard's quiet. The fields of the Southern Canal. And you begin a new column on the papyrus to keep the barley separate from the emmer, drawing a vertical red line with the ochre ink from the second hollow of your palette, a clean stroke that divides the scroll into two clear sections. The first barley sack is heaved onto a shoulder and carried up the ramp with the same steady gait you have been watching all morning, and you make the initial mark for the new estate, a short vertical stroke in the fresh column, and then you add the hieratic sign for barley, a shape that is different from the emmer sign, more angular, with a downward hook at its base. Your hand knows this sign as well as it knows the other, and it forms itself on the papyrus without hesitation, the brush moving through the familiar curve and then lifting, the ink settling into the fibers with a slight spread that you have come to expect from the blunted tip. The porter passes your mat and empties his sack into the pit, and the sound of the barley pouring out is a little different from the sound of the emmer, a lighter, faster rustle, the smaller grains sliding over each other with a whisper that is almost like the sound of sand shifting under a gentle wave. The dust that rises from the barley is paler too, a fine beige cloud that hangs in the air and gives the courtyard a faint scent of dried grass and clean straw. You settle into the new rhythm, the brush moving from right to left across the papyrus in the ancient way, the column of barley marks growing longer with each porter who passes. The names of the estates change occasionally, and you write each one carefully, the hieratic signs flowing together in a script that is a simplified version of the formal hieroglyphs, a handwriting made for speed and clarity. And your speed is not hurried, but it is steady, each entry completed in the time it takes for a porter to walk from the ramp to the pit. The sequence becomes a kind of quiet music in your mind. The call of the estate name, the stroke of the brush, the hiss of the grain, and then the pause in which you lift your eyes to the next porter and the next sack, the whole process repeating with small variations that keep it from becoming entirely automatic, but that are not different enough to require your full attention. Your hand knows the work so deeply that you can let your thoughts drift, floating away across the courtyard and the river and the fields beyond, while your fingers continue their small, precise task. The barley deliveries come in a larger volume than the emmer did, the second barge having been loaded with more sacks of a lighter grain, and the porters work through them steadily, their pace unchanged by the change in cargo. One man, a broad-shouldered fellow with a shaved head and a missing tooth, carries his sacks with a particular rhythm, a slight bounce in his step that makes the sack jostle on his shoulder, and each time he passes, you notice the way the dust shakes off the fabric in a fine spray. Another porter, an older man with grey in his hair, walks more slowly, but with a careful deliberation, placing each foot as though the ground were uneven, even though it is packed flat, and he calls out the estate name in a voice so soft you have to lean forward slightly to catch it. You record them all, the fast and the slow, the loud and the quiet, the marks on the papyrus making no distinction between them, only the numbers and the origins. The sun has begun its slow descent from the peak of noon, though the heat has not yet lessened, and the shadows in the courtyard have shifted again, the sycamore's shade now stretching out toward the granary wall rather than pooling directly around the trunk. You have moved your mat twice during the morning, small adjustments of a handspan or two to stay within the cool darkness, and now you move it a third time, lifting yourself and the papyrus and the pallet together in an awkward shuffle that ends with you settled in a new patch of shade that should last for another hour. The river stones that hold the scroll flat are warm to the touch now, having absorbed the heat of the air, and you turn them over so that the cooler undersides are against the papyrus, a small action that you perform without thinking, one of the many tiny routines that fill your day. The barley column has grown to 30 marks, and you pause to count them, running a finger down the papyrus from the top of the column to the bottom, your lips moving slightly as you tally the strokes. 30 sacks from 3 different estates, the largest delivery from the temple fields of Sobek, a place you imagine as a stretch of dark earth near a canal, with a small shrine of mud brick and a grove of date palms. You have never been there, but you have written its name so many times that it feels familiar, a place that exists in your mind as a collection of written signs rather than as a real landscape. You draw a short horizontal line under the temple's group of marks and add the summary number in red ink, a small notation that will make the final reckoning easier, and then you return to the main tally, dipping your brush and beginning the next group. The ink in your palette has now been refreshed twice, and you are running low on the clean water in your jar, the level having dropped to just above the curve of the clay bottom. You consider walking to the river to refill it, but you decide to wait until the next break, because the path to the water steps is fully in the sun now, and the thought of leaving the shade is unappealing. Instead, you use the remaining water sparingly, just a drop at a time, and you accept that the ink will be a little thicker and the lines a little darker for the rest of this shift. The brush continues to soften, its tip spreading into a small fan of fibers that you have to reshape with your fingers every few minutes, pinching the bristles together and twisting them slightly to restore a point, and this small maintenance task becomes part of the rhythm too, something your hands do while your eyes are on the porters. A hoopoe lands on the granary wall, its crest raised in a fan of black-tipped feathers, and it makes its distinctive call, a low, soft hoo-hoo, that sounds like someone blowing across the mouth of a jar. You look up at it, grateful for the small distraction, and you watch as it hops along the top of the wall, pecking at the mud brick as if searching for insects, its long curved bill tapping against the clay. The bird stays for several minutes, and then it flies away with a flash of black and white wings, disappearing over the palm grove, and you return your gaze to the papyrus where the barley marks wait for the next edition. The courtyard feels very quiet after the hoopoe's departure, the silence settling back in like a soft cloth, and you become aware of the sound of your own breathing, a gentle rise and fall that matches the pace of the work. The porters continue their unending chain, the barley sacks coming one after another with a regularity that makes time feel stretched and fluid, the morning and the afternoon blurring into a single long moment of light and heat and movement. You lose track of the number of times you have dipped your brush, the number of marks you have made, the number of names you have written, and you exist instead in a state of quiet attention that is not quite thinking and not quite dreaming. A middle place where the world is reduced to the small circle of your mat, your papyrus, and the procession of sacks moving past you. The barley dust settles on your shoulders and in your hair, a fine pale powder that you will wash off in the river at the end of the day, and your eyes feel slightly gritty from the dust in the air. But you do not mind these discomforts, because they are part of the work, part of the day, part of the life you have chosen. The overseer under his portico has begun to doze, his chin dropping to his chest and then lifting again, his eyes closed for longer and longer intervals, and you are not concerned because you know he will wake fully when it is time to check the tallies. His presence is a comfortable one, a familiar shape in the shade, and the fact that he can sleep while the work goes on around him is a sign of how orderly everything is, how smoothly the granary operates. The porters do not slacken their pace. They do not need to be watched, because the work is its own overseer, the rhythm of the chain compelling each man to do his part. You dip your brush and make another mark, and another, and the column grows longer. A small breeze stirs, the first true breeze of the afternoon, and it comes from the north, from the direction of the sea that you have never seen, carrying a faint coolness that is more a promise than a reality. The breeze ruffles the edge of your papyrus scroll, lifting it just slightly so that it flaps against the river stone with a soft ticking sound, and you place your spare hand on the corner to hold it down, feeling the air move over your skin like a ghost of the evening to come. The breeze passes, and the air returns to stillness, but the brief touch of coolness has refreshed you, and you continue your work with a renewed sense of calm, the brush moving over the papyrus in its small repeated arcs. The barley deliveries from the second barge finally come to an end, the last sack emptied into the pit with a final whisper of grain, and the bargemen pole their vessel away from the ramp, their work done for now. A third barge is waiting out on the river, but it has not yet approached the ramp, and there is a natural pause in the chain while the porters drink water and talk among themselves. Their voices a low murmur that blends with the sound of the river. You use this pause to clean your brush properly, swishing it in the remaining water in your jar and then wiping it on a scrap of linen until the bristles are pale and dry, and you set it aside to rest while you wait for the next delivery to begin. Your hand feels empty without the brush, and you flex your fingers again, working out the cramp that has begun to form in the web between your thumb and forefinger, a dull ache that is the physical record of the morning's tallies. You look out through the gate toward the river, where the third barge is now drifting slowly toward the ramp, its deck piled with more sacks marked with the barley seal, and you know that the afternoon will be much like the morning, a continuation of the same slow work under the same slow sun. The thought does not weary you. It settles over you like a familiar blanket, the comfort of knowing exactly what the next hours will bring. You pick up your brush again, its tip restored to a passable sharpness by your cleaning, and you dip it into the ink that has now darkened to a near black paste in the palette's hollow, and you wait for the first porter of the new delivery to call out his estate name, the papyrus ready before you, the day still unfolding in its quiet, unhurried way. The last of the morning's barley sacks has been emptied, and the barge has pulled away from the ramp, and now a stillness falls over the granary compound that is deeper than the stillness of the earlier rest period, a full noon quiet that presses down from the sky and up from the earth at the same time. The sun stands directly overhead, or nearly so, and the shadows have shrunk to nothing, the sycamore tree casting only a small dark circle directly around its trunk, the walls of the compound throwing no shade at all on their outer sides. The heat is a weight, a thick golden blanket that makes the air shimmer above every surface, and even the river seems to move more slowly, its surface flat and glaring like a shield of polished copper. The porters have retreated to the deepest shade they can find, some of them lying flat on the ground inside the granary doorway where the stored grain keeps the floor cool, others sitting with their backs against the north wall where a narrow strip of shadow has begun to form. No one speaks now. The time for talking has passed, and the only sounds are the distant call of a kite circling high above the fields and the soft inevitable murmur of the river. You gather your kit with slow, careful movements, knowing that the noon reckoning is a task that requires your full attention and that it will take place in the deeper shade of the portico where the overseer sits. You lift the papyrus scroll first, holding it with both hands so that the rolled portion does not spring open and spill your morning's work across the ground, and you tuck it under your arm with the river stone still in place to keep the written section flat. The palette you pick up with your other hand, careful not to tip the ink hollows, and you leave the water jar and the spare brushes on the mat for now, because you will return to this spot later. The walk across the courtyard is short, only 20 or 30 paces, but the sun presses on your bare shoulders and the top of your head with a physical force that makes you hurry just slightly, your feet moving faster than they have all day, and you feel a relief when you step into the shade of the portico that is almost like stepping into cool water. The portico is a simple structure, a roof of palm logs laid side by side and covered with a thick layer of dried mud and straw, supported by 4 columns made of bundled palm trunks that have been set into the earth and plastered over with the same mud as the walls. The roof extends outward from the front of the granary building, creating a deep shaded space that is open on 3 sides, and the floor here is not packed earth, but a raised platform of mud brick that has been smoothed and swept clean. The air under the portico is noticeably cooler than the courtyard air, the thick roof absorbing the sun's heat and releasing it only slowly, and the scent here is of old wood and dry mud, and a faint trace of the incense that was burned here on some long ago ceremonial occasion. You choose a spot near the center pillar, where the light is dim but still bright enough to read by, and you sit down on the cool bricks with your legs folded, the papyrus scroll laid out before you, the papyrus scroll laid out before you, the palette placed to one side. The overseer is already there, seated on his own mat a few paces away, and he has been dozing lightly with his back against the pillar. But when you settle yourself, he opens his eyes and straightens up, rubbing his face with both hands in a slow circular motion that leaves his cheeks slightly reddened. He is a man of about 50 years, his body thick and solid, his skin browned by a lifetime of working in the sun despite his supervisory rank, and his expression is habitually calm, the face of someone who has seen many harvests come and go, and who no longer feels any urgency about any of them. He nods to you, a formal greeting that acknowledges the official nature of the task you are about to perform together, and you nod back, and then, without speaking, you begin to unroll the morning scroll to its full extent, revealing all the columns you have written since dawn. The papyrus makes a soft, crackling sound as it unrolls, the fibers adjusting to the change in tension, and you weigh down the edges with the river stones you brought, and with a spare stone the overseer keeps beside his mat for exactly this purpose. The scroll now lies open before you like a map of the morning, the red ruled lines dividing the surface into neat vertical columns, the black hieratic marks filling each column with the record of every sack that has passed before you. There is the column for the emmer wheat from the estate of the overseer of the fields, the group of 20 marks with the summary number in red ink beneath. There is the longer column for the barley from the southern canal and the temple fields of Sobek, 30 marks in total with their own red summary number. There are smaller entries too, a delivery of only 5 sacks from a small holding whose name you wrote with extra care because it was unfamiliar, and a single sack of mixed grain that arrived with a note from the village headman, explaining that the harvest had been poor. All of it is there, the morning turned into ink. The overseer shifts closer, moving his mat so that he can see the scroll, and he begins his recitation in a low chant, a voice so quiet and steady that it seems to come from somewhere else, somewhere deep inside the mud brick walls. He does not read from the scroll because he cannot read, or at least he cannot read the scribble script with any fluency, but he has kept his own tally in his memory, a mental record that he has maintained through the whole morning while sitting under his portico, counting each sack as it passed. His method is simple and ancient. For each estate he has made a small pile of pebbles beside his mat, 1 pebble for each sack, and now he counts the pebbles back, touching each one with his forefinger, his lips moving as he numbers them. The estate of the overseer of the fields, he begins, and his voice drops into the same flat tone the porters used, a recitation that sounds like a prayer or a song but is neither, just a list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and he goes on, reaching 20, and then he pauses and looks at you. You check the column on the scroll, and you see that you have recorded 20 marks for that estate, matching his count exactly. You make a small red check mark beside the summary number, a sign that the tally has been verified, and then you say 20, confirmed, in a voice that is just as quiet as his, the words barely disturbing the noon stillness. He nods and moves to the next pile of pebbles, the one for the southern canal estate, and he begins counting again, his finger touching each pebble in turn, his chant continuing, 1, 2, 3, and so on, until he reaches 15. You look at the scroll and you count the marks in that column, and again they match, 15 strokes in a neat row, and you make another red check mark and say, 15, confirmed. The process is slow and methodical, and it requires a certain kind of attention that is different from the attention of writing, a checking attention that moves back and forth between the overseer's voice and the marks on the papyrus, comparing and confirming, and there is a quiet satisfaction in each match, a small feeling of order being maintained. The third estate, the temple fields of Sobek, proves more complicated. The overseer counts his pebbles and arrives at 14, and you look at your column and count only 13 marks. You count again, touching each stroke with the tip of your finger, and still there are 13, and you feel a small tightening in your chest, not anxiety, but simply the awareness that something must be corrected. You look up at the overseer and say, 13 here, and he frowns slightly, not with anger, but with the same mild concern. And he counts his pebbles again, and this time he picks up one pebble and examines it as though it might reveal some secret. A sack was torn, he says after a moment, his voice thoughtful. The porter from the temple fields, the one with the limp, he had a torn sack at the ramp. The grain spilled, and he gathered what he could, but the full measure was not delivered. I counted the sack, but the grain was not full. You listen and you remember the incident now, a brief commotion near the ramp earlier in the morning, a porter kneeling to scoop spilled grain back into a torn sack, the overseer watching, and then making a gesture that you had not understood at the time. You did not record that sack because it was never fully poured into the pit, and you realize that the overseer's mental tally includes it while your written tally does not. You reach for your palette and you take a small brush, the one you keep for corrections, and you dip it into a drop of water to soften the tip, and then you very carefully write a small notation in the margin beside the temple fields column, a note in red ink that explains the discrepancy, a single hieratic sentence that says, 1 sack torn, grain incomplete, not measured. The red ink stands out against the black of the tallies, a bright note of clarification, and you add the number 14 in red beside your summary of 13, indicating the Athsketh. The overseer watches this without comment, and when you are finished he nods once, a small satisfied nod, and he moves on to the next pile of pebbles. The correction has been made, the record is now accurate, and the quiet rhythm of the reckoning resumes. The remaining deliveries are smaller and simpler, the little holding with its 5 sacks which matches perfectly, and the single mixed rain sack which also matches, and you work your way through the entire scroll until every column has been checked and every total confirmed or corrected. The overseer's chant continues throughout, a low, steady recitation that seems to come from somewhere deep in his chest, and your own voice joins his occasionally, a simple word or two, your two voices blending in the hot, still air under the portico. The work of checking is slower than the work of writing, each mark examined individually, each column counted twice, and the concentration it requires is a heavy, quiet thing that fills your mind completely, leaving no room for stray thoughts or wandering attention. You feel the weight of the noon hour in your body, the drowsy pull of the heat, but you do not give in to it, because the reckoning is not yet finished. When the last column has been checked, you take a fresh piece of papyrus from a small supply that the overseer keeps in a wooden chest under the portico, a scrap of clean material that you will use for the day's summary. On this scrap, you write the final totals for the morning in your neatest hand, the total emmer wheat, the total barley, the total number of sacks from all estates combined, and you note the water level that you will measure later, leaving a blank space for that figure. The summary is a small document in itself, a condensed version of the full scroll, and it will be placed in the granary's archive chest at the end of the day, a record that can be consulted quickly without unrolling the whole scroll. You write the date at the top, the regnal year and the month and the day, and you sign your name at the bottom, a small scribal flourish that you have written so many times it no longer feels like your name, but simply like a mark that means you. The overseer takes the summary scrap from you and looks at it, not reading it but simply holding it, his thick fingers careful on the delicate papyrus, and he gives another nod, the final nod of the reckoning, a gesture that releases you from the formal task and allows the day to move into its second half. He places the scrap in the wooden chest and closes the lid, and then he leans back against his pillar and closes his eyes, his body settling into rest with the ease of a man who can sleep anywhere at any time. You remain sitting for a few minutes longer, allowing the tension of the checking work to drain out of your shoulders and your neck, and you look out across the courtyard where the heat still shimmers and the porters still sleep and the river still flows. And you feel a quiet sense of completion, the morning's work now sealed and verified, a closed circle of ink and grain. You roll the main scroll back up slowly, carefully, keeping the tension even as you turn it, and you tie it with the linen cord, the cylinder of papyrus now a neat record of the morning that will be added to the afternoon's tallies later. You set it aside and you take up your palette, and you notice that the ink in the hollows has nearly dried out entirely, the black residue cracked and flaking at the edges, the red ochre reduced to a dusty powder. You will need fresh water and perhaps a new ink cake before the afternoon deliveries begin, and you make a mental note to return to the river steps for water and to grind a little more ink from the spare cakes you keep in your kit. But these are small tasks, and for now you allow yourself to sit in the deep shade of the portico, doing nothing, your hands resting palm up on your knees, your eyes half closed against the glare beyond the roof. The noon hour stretches out, a long slow pause at the center of the day, and the world seems to hold its breath. Even the river sounds quieter now, the water low and slack in the heat, and the birds are silent, and the porters under the granary doorway do not stir. The only movement is the slow crawl of a small lizard across the mud brick wall, its body pressed flat against the clay, and you watch it without really seeing it, your mind as still and blank as the unused papyrus. The heat is a presence beside you, a drowsy companion, and you let it be, knowing that in another hour the sun will begin its descent and the afternoon breeze will rise and the work will resume. But for now there is only the shade and the quiet and the slow drift of the noon toward its end. The noon stillness holds for a long unmeasured time, the kind of time that does not pass so much as it pools, collecting around you in the deep shade of the portico until you feel as though you have always been sitting here and will always remain. Then, without announcement, the first small movement of the afternoon stirs the air, a single breath of wind that comes from the north where the river widens and the delta begins its slow spread toward the sea. The breeze slips through the granary gate like an invisible guest, lifting a few strands of chaff and setting them down again, touching your cheek with a coolness that is so faint it might be imagined. You open your eyes fully and you see the leaves of the sycamore turning, their pale undersides flashing silver as they twist on their stems, and the sound they make is a dry, papery rustle that blends with the river's murmur and the distant cry of a bird and the soft creak of a palm trunk somewhere outside the wall. The heat does not break all at once, but it shifts, the heavy stillness giving way to a gentle movement that carries the scent of the river more strongly, a green, watery scent that cools the inside of your nose. The overseer opens his eyes as well, awakened not by any sound but by the change in the air itself, and he stretches his arms out in front of him with a slow, deliberate motion, his shoulders cracking softly. He looks toward the river, then toward you, and he makes a small gesture with his chin, a lifting motion that means the measuring post. You understand at once, because this is part of the afternoon routine on days when the deliveries have been heavy and the water level has not yet been recorded. A task that must be done before the sun moves too far from its peak and the light slants wrong across the painted marks. You set aside the rolled scroll and the pallet, leaving them in the safety of the portico shade, and you rise to your feet, your legs slightly stiff from the long sit, the muscles of your thighs protesting with a dull ache that fades as soon as you take your first steps. The walk to the river is a short one, no more than 100 paces, but it takes you out of the granary compound and into the full open air, where the breeze is stronger and more steady. You pass through the gate and turn left, following the path that runs along the base of the compound wall, and then you descend a gentle slope where the grass is sparse and the earth is cracked into a web of shallow fissures from the sun. At the bottom of the slope, the ground levels out and becomes a narrow beach of packed silt, and here the stone steps begin. A series of flat limestone blocks that have been set into the riverbank long ago, their surfaces worn smooth by water and by countless bare feet. The steps lead down into the river at an angle, disappearing under the surface one by one, and the water laps against them with a soft repetitive sound, a quiet liquid kiss that is higher one moment and lower the next, as the small wavelets move through. The measuring post stands to the right of the steps, a thick wooden column painted with bands of white and black that divide it into sections. The post has been driven deep into the riverbed, and it leans very slightly to one side, a tilt that is old and settled and that the overseer has long since accounted for in his calculations. The painted marks begin just above the waterline and continue downward, showing the measurements in cubits and palms, the cubits marked with longer lines and the palms with shorter ones, the numbers painted in black on the white sections so that they can be read from the bank. The water moves around the post in a gentle swirl, small eddies that spin and dissolve, and the current here is slow, the river wide and deep and patient. You stand on the lowest dry step, the stone cool under your feet despite the sun, and you bend forward slightly to read the level where the water touches the paint. Reading the post is a careful task that requires a steady gaze and a moment of stillness. The surface of the water is never perfectly flat, and the small waves created by the breeze and the current make the exact intersection of water and paint slightly uncertain. So you watch for a while, letting your eyes adjust to the movement, waiting for the pattern to reveal itself. The water rises and falls by a finger's width, a gentle oscillation, and you note the highest point the wetness reaches on the paint and the lowest point, and then you take the middle as the true level. Today the water stands at 3 cubits and 2 palms, a level that is moderate for this time of the season, neither too high nor too low, a level that means the fields will receive their irrigation without difficulty, and the tax assessments will remain as they were projected. You say the numbers to yourself in a whisper, 3 cubits and 2 palms, and you repeat them silently until they are fixed in your memory. You remain on the step for a moment longer, not because you need to, but because the river is beautiful in the afternoon light and the breeze is pleasant on your skin. The water is a deep brownish green here near the bank, clear enough to see the smooth stones on the bottom, and the occasional silver flash of a small fish darting through the shallows. The far bank, a quarter of a league away, is a solid line of papyrus thickets and acacia trees, and above them the sky is a pale blue that has begun to soften from the hard white of noon, the colour deepening toward the east where the evening will eventually arrive. A kingfisher perches on the top of the measuring post, its plumage a brilliant blue-green that glints in the sun, and it watches the water with the fixed intensity of a hunter waiting for the movement that will send it diving. You watch the bird and the bird watches the water, and for a little while nothing happens, and then the kingfisher plunges, a straight drop that ends in a splash and a quick return to the post with a minnow in its beak, and you smile slightly at the small drama before turning to climb back up the steps. As you walk back along the slope toward the granary gate, the breeze strengthens a little more, enough to press your kilt against your legs and to send a shower of dust skittering across the path. The sycamore tree in the courtyard is now in full motion, its leaves dancing and flashing, and the shade beneath it is dappled with moving spots of light that shift and tremble. The porters have roused themselves from their noon sleep and are gathering near the water jar, splashing their faces and necks with water, talking in tones that are louder and more lively than before, the rest having restored their energy. They look toward the river and see the third barge, which has been waiting out on the water, now poling slowly toward the ramp, with its deck stacked high with more sacks, the barley deliveries resuming after the pause. You re-enter the courtyard and walk directly to your mat, where your kit still waits, and you sit down again, the familiar cross-legged position folding itself around you, the pallet returning to its place on your knees. Before you begin the afternoon's tallies, you take the summary scrap of papyrus from the chest under the portico, and you write the water level in the blank space you left earlier, the numbers flowing neatly from your brush, 3 cubits and 2 palms, the ink fresh and dark from a new mixing. The date is already there, and your name, and the totals from the morning, and now with the water level added, the record is complete for this moment, a snapshot of the day's conditions that will be filed away and consulted when the tax officials arrive. You place the scrap back in the chest, and you unroll the main scroll again, the afternoon's blank column waiting on the right side of the papyrus, the red-ruled lines faint but still clear, and you settle the river stones on the edges to hold it flat. The breeze tugs at the corner of the scroll, lifting it momentarily, and you reach for a third stone, a piece of broken brick that lies nearby, and you place it on the curling edge, anchoring the papyrus securely. The first porter of the afternoon delivery is already walking up the ramp, a sack of barley on his shoulder, and he calls out the estate name in a voice that seems louder and clearer than before. The words carried on the freshening air, the fields of the southern canal, and you dip your brush and begin again. The marks you make are the same marks you had been making all day, the small vertical strokes and the hieratic signs, but there is a difference now in the way the work feels, a lightness that comes from the cooling breeze and the knowledge that the noon reckoning is behind you, and the knowledge that noon reckoning is behind you, and the day is moving toward its close. The heat has lost its pressing weight, and the air has become almost gentle, a soft moving warmth that dries the sweat on your skin as soon as it forms. The porters move with a slightly quicker step, not hurried, but refreshed, and the chain of sacks flows up the ramp and past your mat and into the pit with a steady rhythm that feels effortless, the work carrying itself forward on the momentum of the afternoon. The barley grains pour into the storage chamber with their light, whispery rustle, and the dust that rises is caught by the breeze and carried away toward the river, so that the air around your mat stays clearer than it did in the morning. You notice the small things again, the way the barley chaff gleams palely against the darker earth of the courtyard, the way one porter hums a tune under his breath as he walks, a tune that is just a few notes repeated and that blends with the sound of the river and the leaves. Your brush moves across the papyrus in its small, precise arcs, and your hand feels rested after the noon break, the muscles loose and easy, the reed responding to your lightest touch. The column grows longer, stroke by stroke, and you add the estate names as they change, and you note the occasional full sack or slightly light sack with the same small marks you used earlier, the work absorbing your attention without demanding it. The afternoon stretches out in a way that is different from the morning, less a dense block of time and more a long, slow unwinding, each moment distinct and unhurried, the sun sliding down the western sky by increments so small you cannot see them, but you can feel them in the changing angle of the light. The shadows lengthen again, the sycamore shade stretching across the courtyard and climbing up the far wall, and the color of the light deepens from white gold to amber, the same color as the barley grain, the same color as the sand on the riverbank. The breeze continues its steady flow, and with it comes the smell of something cooking from the village, a smell of onions and oil and bread that reminds you that you will eat again when the day is done, a simple meal at the end of a simple day. You let the thought drift through your mind without holding on to it, and you continue to write, the brush moving, the sacks passing, the river flowing. The third barge is emptied slowly over the course of the afternoon, and a fourth barge arrives after it, this one carrying more emmer wheat from a different estate, the seals on the sacks showing a stylized palm tree that you recognize as the mark of the southern fields beyond the first cataract. The porters call the new name, and you write it down, and the emmer joins the barley in the storage pit, the two grains mixing somewhere in the darkness below, their separate records preserved on your papyrus even as their physical forms combine. The work continues without interruption, without any event that rises above the low hum of routine, and you settle into it the way a boat settles into a gentle current, moving forward without effort, the day carrying you along. The kingfisher you saw at the river flies over the granary wall and perches briefly on the sycamore branch above you, and you glance up at it, a flicker of blue in the green leaves, and then it is gone, and you return your eyes to the papyrus. As the sun approaches the tops of the palm trees on the western side of the compound, the deliveries begin to slow, the porters taking longer between sacks, the barges riding higher and lighter on the water as their cargoes are emptied. The overseer has risen from his mat and is walking slowly around the courtyard, checking the ropes on the storage hatch, speaking a few words to the porters, his presence a calm supervisory weight that keeps everything in order. You continue to write until the last sack of the fourth barge is emptied, and then you draw a final mark in the column and lay down your brush, the afternoon's tally complete. The scroll before you now holds the full record of the day, morning and afternoon, emmer and barley, the deliveries from 6 different estates, the water level, the notations of torn sacks and light measures, all of it captured in the neat rows of black and red signs that your hand has produced. You look at the scroll with a quiet satisfaction, not pride, but simply the recognition of work done, and you begin the slow process of cleaning your brushes and closing the day's account, the breeze still blowing softly as the evening approaches. Late in the day, When the sun has dropped far enough that the light no longer comes from overhead but slants across the courtyard in long golden bands, your hand knows the work so completely that you stop needing to look at the papyrus. The brush finds its place on the faint red ruling lines without your eyes guiding it, the tip settling into the column and tracing the small vertical strokes with the same unthinking accuracy that your feet use to find the firm spots on the path from your house. You have written these signs so many times over so many days that they have become a part of your body, a set of movements stored in the muscles of your fingers and wrist and forearm, and now you can let your gaze lift away from the scroll and watch the porters as they pass. Observe the courtyard as it changes in the late light, while your hand continues its quiet work. The sensation is a strange one, a feeling of being divided, your eyes taking in the world while your hand produces the record of that world without any conscious instruction. And it is a feeling that comes only late in a long day of tallying, when fatigue and familiarity have combined to dissolve the boundary between thought and action. The porters move through the last of the afternoon deliveries with a pace that is slowed just slightly, their bodies tired from the hours of lifting and carrying, but their rhythm remains steady, the same chain of men walking up from the ramp and past your mat and back again. You watch them without really watching, your gaze resting on the nearest man as he adjusts the sack on his shoulder, and your hand makes a mark, and then your gaze drifts to the way the dust on the ground has been trampled into a fine powder that puffs up around each footfall, and your hand makes another mark, and then you look at the sycamore leaves flickering at the edge of your vision, and the brush dips into the ink and rises and makes a third mark, the column growing longer while your attention floats free. The estate names are called out, one after another, and your hand records them too, the hieratic signs for the southern canal and the temple fields and the palm tree estate forming themselves on the papyrus with a fluency that feels like water flowing along a familiar channel. The sun has begun to slant in a way that changes everything it touches, turning the ordinary mud brick walls into surfaces of deep amber, the rough texture of the bricks suddenly visible as a pattern of light and shadow that you had not noticed during the flat brightness of noon. The shadows of the palm trunks outside the compound walls stretch across the courtyard now, long dark stripes that lie over the packed earth like strips of cloth, and as the sun sinks lower, these shadows lengthen, creeping slowly toward the granary door, moving so gradually that you cannot see the movement, but you can notice its result when you glance up after a span of minutes. The whole courtyard is being crossed by shadows, the sycamore tree casting a great irregular pool of darkness that now reaches all the way to the storage pit, and within that darkness smaller shadows flicker, the shadows of leaves and branches, making the ground seem to shift and breathe. The dust in the air, which during the middle of the day was an invisible haze, has become visible again in the slanting light, each particle catching the sun individually so that the space between you and the granary wall appears filled with a gentle golden snowfall. The dust motes hang and drift, rising on the small currents of air that move through the courtyard, and they sparkle faintly, a million tiny points of light that swirl and settle and rise again. You watch a single mote as it floats past your face, a fleck of chaff or a grain of dried earth, and you follow its slow descent until it lands on the edge of your papyrus, where it sits for a moment before a puff of breeze lifts it away. The air itself feels thicker now, softened by the golden light, and the temperature has dropped just enough that the sweat on your skin has dried and left a faint coolness in its place. a coolness that is the first promise of the evening. Your hand continues its work through all of this, the brush dipping and stroking, the ink drying instantly on the warm papyrus, and you become aware of the soft sound the brush makes as it moves across the fibers, a sound so quiet that you can only hear it when you are not listening for it, a tiny whisper that is the voice of the writing itself. The reed brush has softened again over the course of the afternoon, the tip spreading into a small fan, and your hand compensates for this without any decision on your part, adjusting the pressure and the angle so that the lines remain clean and the signs remain legible. This is the knowledge that lives in your fingers, a knowledge that cannot be taught or explained, only acquired through years of sitting on a reed mat with a palette on your knees, and it is a knowledge that feels like a gift from the river, a quiet skill that has grown into you as slowly and as naturally as the silt builds the banks. A hoopoe calls from somewhere near the granary wall, its voice a soft low series of notes that sound like hoo hoo hoo, and the call is so familiar that it almost escapes your notice, blending with the rustle of the leaves and the murmur of the water and the padding of the porter's feet. Then the bird calls again, a little closer this time, and you lift your gaze from the courtyard and see it perched on the top of the wall, its crest raised in a fan, its body a warm cinnamon color, with bold stripes of black and white across the wings. The hoopoe tilts its head, peering down into the courtyard with one bright eye, and then it bobs its head in the way that hoopoes do, the small comical motion that makes you smile. You watch it for a full minute, your hands still moving across the papyrus below you, and then the bird flies down into the courtyard, landing near the base of the sycamore tree, where it begins to probe the earth with its long, curved bill, searching for insects in the cooling soil. The porters pay it no attention. The bird is a common visitor, and its presence is just another part of the late afternoon scene. The deliveries continue in their slow, steady flow. The fourth barge now nearly empty, its deck visible as a broad, flat surface of weathered planks with only a few sacks remaining near the stern. The bargemen are sitting on the gunwales, their poles laid across their knees, and they talk quietly to each other while they wait for the unloading to finish, their voices carrying across the water in fragments that are softened by distance. The porters move more slowly now, their rest at noon a distant memory, and they take the time to adjust the sacks carefully before lifting, to walk with a measured tread that conserves their remaining strength. The overseer has returned to his mat under the portico and is sitting with his legs stretched out, his hands folded on his stomach, his face calm and expressionless in the deepening shade. He has done his part for the day, the noon reckoning completed, and the water level recorded, and now he simply waits for the last of the grain to be stored, a quiet presence that holds the whole operation together without any need for words. You feel the day's accumulated stillness beginning to settle into your body, a heaviness that is not unpleasant, a slow, comfortable tiredness that fills your shoulders and your eyelids and the back of your neck. This is the tiredness that comes from a task repeated until it becomes indistinguishable from rest, a tiredness that is almost a form of peace, and you do not resist it. You let your shoulders drop slightly, releasing a tension you did not know you were holding, and you feel your breathing slow and deepen, your chest rising and falling in a rhythm that matches the rhythm of the brush on the papyrus. The world around you seems to soften, the edges of things losing their sharpness, the sounds of the courtyard blending into a single low hum that is the sound of the day winding down. You are not sleepy, not in the sense of wanting to lie down and close your eyes, but you are in a state that is adjacent to sleep, a waking restfulness that fills your mind with a gentle haze. The column on the papyrus grows longer, the marks accumulating in neat rows, and you realize that you have been writing without pausing to count, trusting your hand to keep the tally accurate while your mind drifts. You glance down at the scroll, and you see that the work is good, the signs clear and well formed, the grouping separated by the short red lines, and you feel a small quiet satisfaction that is too mild to be called pride. The papyrus itself has warmed in the late sun, its surface holding the heat of the day, and the smell of it rises to you, a dry papery scent that is the smell of the plant from which it was made, the papyrus reed that grows in the marshes and that has been transformed into this smooth, pale surface that holds your words. The ink has darkened to a deep black, and the red ochre of the summary numbers glows in the golden light like small embers, and the whole scroll is a beautiful object in its own quiet way, a thing made by your hand over the course of this long ordinary day. A second hoopoe lands on the wall, joining the first, and the two birds bob their heads at each other in a brief greeting before the first one flies away over the palm grove. The remaining hoopoe stays for a while, walking along the top of the wall with a dipping stride, and then it too disappears, and the wall is empty again. The sun has now dropped below the tops of the palm trees, and the shadows have merged into a single great shadow that covers the entire courtyard, except for a strip of golden light along the eastern wall, a strip that narrows even as you watch, the darkness climbing upward like water rising. The air has taken on a faint blue quality, the first hint of dusk, and the sky overhead has deepened from pale blue to a richer shade, the color of lapis lazuli ground, fine and mixed with a little water, and a single star has appeared in the east, a tiny point of white that is barely visible against the still bright sky. The porters empty the last sack from the fourth barge, and the chain breaks apart naturally, the men drifting toward the water jar and the shade, their work for the day essentially complete. The bargemen push off from the ramp with their poles, the empty vessel sliding out into the current, and it turns slowly as it drifts downstream, its hull dark against the shining water. You watch it go until it passes behind the clump of reeds at the bend, and then you return your attention to the scroll, where you have recorded the final delivery, the last mark in the last column, and you set down your brush for what feels like the final time. Your hand remains curled around the absent reed for a moment, the muscles slow to release their habitual grip, and then you open your fingers and let the brush rest on the palette, the shaft still warm from your touch. You flex your hand slowly, feeling the ache that has settled into the joints, a dull, steady ache that is the physical memory of the thousands of small movements you have made since dawn. The web between your thumb and forefinger is tender, and the tip of your middle finger has a small callus where the reed presses against it, a callus that has been there for so long you no longer think of it as anything but a part of your hand. You rub the callus with your thumb, feeling its smooth hardness, and then you stretch your fingers wide and hold them there, letting the stretch pull at the tendons in your wrist, a sensation that is almost painful but also satisfying, the way stretching always is after a long time of stillness. Your other hand, the one that held the scroll flat and mixed the ink and poured the water, is less tired, but still marked by the day's work, the nails rimmed with dark ink, the palm smudged with grey. The light continues to fade, the strip of gold on the eastern wall now reduced to a thin line that flickers and then disappears, and the whole courtyard falls into shadow. The temperature drops a little more, and you feel the coolness on your arms and the back of your neck, a coolness that carries the scent of the river more strongly, the green wet smell of water and reeds and mud, the smell of the Nile breathing out after the heat of the day. A bat flits across the darkening sky, its flight erratic and swift, and you follow its path for a moment before losing it against the palm fronds. From the village, the sound of a dog barking reaches you, and then another dog answers, and then silence again. The everyman rises from his mat and walks slowly toward the storage pit, where he will close the wooden hatch for the night, and the porters gather their carrying poles and their empty sacks, preparing to leave. The day is nearly over, and you sit on your mat in the gathering dusk, the completed scroll before you, and you feel the stillness of the evening settling over you like a second shade, heavy and soft and full of rest. The last porter empties his sack into the storage pit, and the grain whispers down into the darkness. A sound that has become so familiar over the course of the day that you almost do not hear it anymore, the way you do not hear your own breathing. The man shakes the sack once, twice, and then folds it under his arm and walks away toward the gate, his bare feet scuffing through the dust that has been churned to a fine soft powder, and he does not look back because there is no need to look back. The work is finished. You watch him go, a figure in a pale kilt moving through the deepening dusk, and then you turn your attention to the scroll on the mat before you, the long column of marks that has grown across the papyrus since dawn, and you know that there is one final task remaining before the day can be put away, the closing of the accounts, the summary that will seal the record and make it complete. You pick up your brush for what you know will be the last time today, the reed light and familiar between your fingers, and you dip it into the ink that has now thickened to a dark paste in the hollow of the palette, and you lean forward over the papyrus. At the bottom of the day's columns, below the last of the barley marks and the emmer marks, and the small notations of torn sacks and light measures, you begin to write the summary. Your hand moves slowly now, more deliberately than it has moved all day, because these final lines must be clear and correct, the lasting record that will be read by other eyes, stored in other chests, copied into other scrolls. You write the total number of emmer sacks received, counting the marks in the column one last time to be certain, and then you write the hieratic numbers, the signs for tens and ones that together make the figure. You write the total barley sacks, the number slightly larger than the emmer, the 2 grains accounted for separately. You add them together and write the grand total of all sacks delivered to the granary on this day, in the regnal year that you have already noted at the top of the column, the month and the day inscribed in red ochre that has dried to a dull crimson. Below the totals you write a brief notation of the water level, the 3 cubits and 2 palms that you read from the measuring post in the afternoon, the figure that will be consulted when the tax assessors arrive and when the irrigation overseers make their plans. You note the condition of the grain, a single word in hieratic that means good, because the sacks were dry and free of mold and the weevils had not yet found them. You note the number of torn sacks, which was only 1, the barley sack from the temple fields that the porter with the limp had tried to save, and you note the approximate loss as the overseer estimated it, a fraction of a measure that will be deducted from the estate's tax obligation. These details are small, but they matter. The fine grain of the record, and you write them with the care that they deserve, your brush forming each sign with the precision of long practice. When the summary is complete, you set the brush down across the palette and you read the lines back once and then twice, your eyes moving from right to left across the hieratic signs, your lips forming the words silently. The numbers are correct and the notations are clear, and the red ink of the summary headings stands out against the black of the tallies, a neat visual hierarchy that any scribe would recognize. You check the addition one more time, counting the marks in the emmer column, counting the marks in the barley column, adding them in your head, and comparing the result to the grand total you have written, and everything matches. A small quiet feeling settles in your chest, the feeling of a task completed properly, of a record that is true, and you let out a breath that you had not realized you were holding. Now the work of cleaning begins, a slow methodical process that is as much a part of the day as the writing itself, the ritual that separates the time of labor from the time of rest. You lift the palette from your knees and you examine it in the fading light, the two hollows where the ink has been mixed all day, the black hollow now containing only a dry, cracked residue around the edges, and a small pool of thickened ink in the center, the red hollow almost entirely dry, the ochre reduced to a fine powder that has settled into the corners. The wood around the hollows is stained dark from years of use, the grain of the sycamore wood showing through the ink in fine dark lines, and the thumbprint where you hold the palette is worn smooth, a shallow depression that fits your thumb exactly. You reach for the water jar, which still holds a small amount of water at the bottom, and you pour a little into the black hollow, just enough to soften the dried ink, the water spreading across the residue and turning dark at once. You take a scrap of linen from the bundle beside your mat, a piece of old cloth that has been used for this purpose many times and that is stiff with dried ink in places, and you dip a corner into the water and begin to wipe the palette clean. The ink dissolves slowly, staining the cloth with fresh blackness, and you work the damp fabric around the hollow in small circles, loosening the dried residue, lifting it away from the wood. The smell of the wet ink rises to you, a sharper smell than the dry ink, a smell of soot and gum and something slightly acrid, and it mingles with the cooler evening air and the scent of the river and the faint smoke from the village cooking fires. You wipe the hollow until the wood is as clean as it will become, a faint grey stain remaining, and then you pour the last drops of water into the red hollow, and clean that as well, the ochre coming away more easily than the black, leaving behind a pale reddish tint that will never fully disappear. The reed brushes you clean next, taking each one in turn and dipping it into the water that remains in the jar, swishing it gently to loosen the ink from the bristles, and then wiping it on the linen scrap until the bristles are pale and clean. The first brush, the one you used for most of the day, has softened considerably, and the tip has split into a small fan, and you examine it in the dim light, deciding that it will need to be trimmed before tomorrow's work, the end cut fresh, with a small bronze knife that you keep in your kit. You set this brush aside, and you clean the second brush, the one you used for the red ink and the summary notations, its bristles finer and softer, still holding their point well. You clean the spare brush too, the one you did not use today but that you keep ready, and then you lay all three brushes on the linen to dry, their handles aligned neatly, their tips pointing away from you. The papyrus scroll now requires your attention, the long roll that has been open all day, and that now holds the complete record of the grain deliveries. You remove the river stones that have been holding the edges flat, the smooth grey stones that are warm from the afternoon sun, and you place them back at the base of the sycamore tree where they always sit, arranging them in a small pile that will be there when you return tomorrow. Without the stones, the papyrus begins to curl at once, the edges rolling inward toward the written surface, and you catch it with your palm, pressing it flat while you prepare to roll it properly. The scroll is long, much longer than it was this morning because you have unrolled so much of it over the course of the day, and rolling it back up will take a little time and a little care. You begin at the bottom edge, the edge closest to you, the edge that holds the summary you have just written, and you fold it upward very slightly, just a small turn of the papyrus, and then you begin to roll the scroll toward the top, keeping the tension even, your left hand turning the roll while your right hand guides the flat portion, smoothing out any wrinkles or bubbles that might form. The papyrus crackles softly as it rolls, a dry, papery sound that is one of the oldest sounds you know, a sound you have heard since you were a boy learning to handle scrolls in the temple school, and the cylinder that forms under your hands is dense and smooth, the layers pressing together without gaps. You turn the scroll slowly and steadily, watching the written columns disappear into the roll, the emmer marks and the barley marks and the estate names and the water level all vanishing into the tight spiral, the day's work becoming a closed object that can be held in one hand. When the roll is complete, you take the linen cord that has been lying on the mat beside you all day, and you wrap it around the scroll once and then twice, crossing the cords and tying them in a simple knot that will hold the papyrus closed, but that can be untied easily in the morning. You pull the knot snug, but not too tight, because the papyrus is delicate and too much pressure can crack the fibers or leave permanent marks, and you test the tension with your fingers, finding it firm enough to hold, but loose enough to give slightly. The tied scroll is a neat cylinder about the length of your forearm, its outer surface the pale yellow of aged papyrus, its inner surface hidden now and holding the 1,000 small marks that your hand has made since dawn, and you set it down on the mat beside the cleaned palette and the drying brushes, all of your tools now restored to order. The water jar you empty onto the ground beside your mat, the last few drops of ink-stained water soaking into the packed earth and disappearing at once, leaving only a small dark spot that will dry by morning. You wipe the inside of the jar with the linen scrap, reaching as far as your fingers will go, and then you set the jar upright to air out overnight, its clay sides still cool to the touch. The palette you wipe down one more time, removing any last traces of moisture, and then you place it flat on the mat with the brushes arranged on top of it, the whole kit ready to be gathered up and carried home. The courtyard around you has grown quiet and dark. The porters all gone now, their voices faded away down the path toward the village, and the overseer has closed the wooden hatch over the storage pit and retired to his small room at the back of the granary, where a single lamp burns with a steady yellow flame. The sycamore tree is a great dark shape against the darkening sky, its leaves still rustling softly in the evening breeze, and the river beyond the gate is a wide band of reflected sky, the last light of the sun catching on the water in a long stripe of pale gold that narrows as you watch, the dusk closing in from the east. A few stars have appeared, more than before, scattered across the deep blue like grains of salt spilled on a dark cloth, and the air is cool now, truly cool. The heat of the day, a memory that lingers only in the warmth of the mud brick walls and the packed earth under your mat. You sit for a moment longer, not because there is anything left to do, but because the moment feels complete in itself. A quiet pause between the work and the walk home. A small space of stillness that you have earned. Your body is tired in a way that is pleasant, your muscles loose and heavy, your mind empty of any urgent thought, and you let the evening settle around you, the sounds of the river and the leaves and the distant barking of a dog blending into a single low hum that is the voice of the world at rest. You think of the scroll you have made, the record that will be placed in the wooden chest with all the other scrolls, the quiet archive of grain and days that grows a little thicker with each passing season, and you think of how tomorrow you will come back to this mat and this tree and this courtyard, and you will do the same work again, the same marks on the same papyrus, the same slow rhythm of tallying and checking and closing the accounts. The thought does not weary you, it comforts you. The knowledge that the world continues in its quiet way and that your place in it is small and steady and sure. You gather your kit, the rolled scroll tucked under one arm and the palette with the brushes balanced on top of it, the water jar held by its narrow neck in your other hand, and you rise from the mat, your knees cracking softly from the long sit. The mat you leave where it is because it belongs to the tree in the courtyard, and it will be there tomorrow, and you turn toward the gate, your bare feet finding the familiar path, the packed earth cool and smooth under your soles. The granary compound recedes behind you, the sycamore tree, a dark silhouette against the stars, and you walk out into the evening, the day's work complete, the scroll a neat cylinder, small enough to hold in one hand. The quiet satisfaction of the closing of the accounts settling into you like the dusk itself. You leave the granary compound through the open gate, the same gate you entered this morning when the light was grey and new and the world was still waking, and now the world is settling towards sleep, and the light is almost gone. A thin band of deep orange lingering along the western hills beyond the palm groves, while the rest of the sky has shifted into a soft indigo that deepens with each step you take. The rolled papyrus is tucked under your arm, a neat cylinder that holds the day's work inside its tight spiral, and the palette and the brushes and the empty water jar are carried in your other hand. The tools of your trade now cleaned and dry and ready for the morning. The weight of the scroll is slight, but you are aware of it, the way you are aware of a full stomach or a tired limb, a small pressure against your side that is the physical presence of the hours you have spent on the reed mat under the sycamore tree. The path before you is the same raised path you walked in the dawn, but the evening has changed it, the packed earth now cool instead of damp, the dew not yet fallen, but the day's heat already drained away into the darkening air. Your bare feet find the familiar spots without your eyes guiding them, the firm places between the stones and the potsherds, the slight rise where the path crosses a root, the shallow dip where rainwater once pooled and left a smooth depression, and you walk with the slow, easy stride of someone who is not in a hurry and has nowhere to be except home. The fields on either side are fields of stubble that you saw this morning as dark earth and pale stalks, and now they are fields of shadow, the outlines of the cut grain still visible as a faint texture against the darker soil, the whole landscape simplified by dusk into broad shapes of black and grey. To your left the Nile moves in its ancient bed, and the river has changed its colour entirely since the afternoon. the bright bronze and copper of the sunlit water replaced by a deep dark surface that holds the last light of the sky in a long shimmering stripe, a path of pale gold and faded rose that stretches from the far bank to the near, trembling slightly with the movement of the current. The water makes the same sound it always makes, a low murmur that never stops, a sound that is more felt than heard, a constant presence that has been there for every evening of your life and will be there for every evening after. You pause for a moment at the place where the path rises slightly to cross a small embankment, and you look out over the river, and you see the first true star reflected in the water, a single point of white light that wavers and blurs and then sharpens again as the surface shifts. The sight of it is so quiet and so familiar that you do not think anything in particular. You simply stand and look, and then you continue walking. The Eversfald of the Samos and incredible lives some of fee hift insulation tricks, the day winding down instead of starting up. From the village ahead you hear the voices of women calling to each other, not loudly but in the ordinary tones of conversation, their words indistinct but their rhythms clear. The rise and fall of speech that is about the small things of the day, the cooking and the children and the water jars. A cow lows somewhere in the fields, a long low sound that carries easily across the open ground, and another cow answers from closer by, and you see a herd of cattle being driven along a side path by a boy with a long stick, the animals moving slowly, their great dark shapes ambling through the dusk with a heavy patience. The boy calls out to them in a high voice, a word or two that you do not catch, and the cattle turn and follow the path toward their by, their hooves making a soft thudding on the earth that fades as they pass. Cooking fires are being lit in the village, and you can see the smoke rising in thin columns against the darkening sky, pale grey plumes that twist and spread and vanish, and the smell of the fires reaches you, a smell of burning acacia wood and dried dung, and something else that is simply the smell of home, the smell of food being prepared and warmth being gathered. One fire flares up briefly, a burst of orange that illuminates the side of a mud brick house and the figure of a woman bending over a pot, and then the flame settles and the scene returns to shadow. The smell of onions cooking drifts across the path, and the smell of bread baking somewhere, the flat loaves placed on the hot stones of an oven, and your stomach stirs slightly at the sense, reminding you that you have not eaten since the midday break, that the flat bread and dried fish are a distant memory now. You pass the small temple that stands at the fork of the path, a simple mud brick building with a low doorway and a roof of palm logs, its walls painted white with a thin wash of lime that catches the last light and glows faintly in the dusk. The temple is dedicated to a minor deity of the river or the harvest. You are not entirely sure which, and it is tended by an old priest who lives in a small room at the back, and who comes out each evening to light the lamp that burns through the night. You see him now, a thin figure in a long white robe, standing on a low stool to reach the lamp that hangs from a wooden bracket beside the door, and he is holding a taper to the wick, the flame catching and growing, a small steady light that pushes back the darkness around the temple entrance. The priest steps down from the stool and sees you passing, and he raises a hand in a silent greeting, a gesture you return with a nod, and then you continue along the path while he disappears back into the temple, his duty done for the evening. The path takes you past a small garden where onions and lettuces grow in neat rows, the plants dark shapes against the paler earth, and you hear the sound of water trickling into an irrigation channel, a small diversion from the main canal that keeps the garden green. A woman is drawing water from a well. The creak of the wooden pulley and the splash of the bucket reaching you in the quiet, and she lifts the full jar to her shoulder in a single smooth motion, her silhouette against the last light of the sky, and she walks away toward the houses. You pass a date palm that leans over the path, its fronds rustling with a dry sound, and you reach up and touch one of the fronds as you pass, the rough texture familiar under your fingers, and then you are at the edge of the village where the houses begin. Your own house is a small mud brick building near the riverside of the path, a house that looks very much like all the other houses, with a flat roof of palm logs and mud and a single doorway covered by a woven reed mat that is now tied up to let the evening air in. The walls are unplastered, the bricks showing through, and there is a small courtyard at the front where you sometimes sit in the cool of the evening. But tonight you are tired, and you walk straight to the doorway, ducking your head slightly as you cross the threshold. Inside the house is dark, the only light coming from the open door and from a small window high in the back wall, a square opening that lets in the faint glow of the sky. The air inside is cool and still and smells of dried reeds and old wood, and the faint, lingering scent of the bread you baked 2 days ago. And the darkness is a comfortable darkness, the darkness of a familiar place that you know by touch. You set your kit down on the low wooden stool where it always sits, the rolled papyrus placed carefully on top of the pallet so that it will not be crushed, and you take the empty water jar to the large clay vessel in the corner and fill it from the dipper. The water cool and clean, the sound of it pouring a soft liquid note in the quiet room. You drink from the jar, a long, slow drink that washes the dust of the day from your throat, and then you pour a little water into a small basin, and you wash your hands and your face, the water cool against your skin, the dust and the ink stains loosening and lifting away. You dry your hands on a scrap of linen that hangs from a peg by the door, and you feel the tiredness in your body as a heaviness that is mostly in your shoulders and your legs, a weight that you have carried since the late afternoon, and that now, in the shelter of your house, you can finally acknowledge. The wooden chest in the corner is where you keep the scrolls, the quiet archive of grain and days that you have built over years of sitting by the sycamore tree, and you open the lid, the hinges made of leather strips that creak softly. Inside the chest, the scrolls are arranged in neat rows, each one tied with its own linen cord, each one a record of a day very much like this one. The tallies of emmer and barley, the water levels, the notations of torn sacks and light measures. You take the day's scroll and you place it in the chest with the others, fitting it into a space at the end of a row, and the scroll settles into place with a small soft sound, the sound of papyrus touching papyrus. You close the lid and you run your hand over the wood, a simple gesture of completion, and then you turn away from the chest, the day's record now stored and safe. The evening meal is simple, the same meal you eat most evenings, and you prepare it with the slow movements of someone who is in no hurry. A small clay pot sits on the shelf, and inside it is the lentil stew that you made yesterday, a thick mixture of brown lentils and onions and a little oil, seasoned with salt and a pinch of cumin. And you scoop a portion into a bowl and set it on the small brazier to warm, the charcoal still glowing from when you lit it earlier. The stew heats slowly, the smell of it rising and filling the room, a rich, earthy smell that makes your stomach feel hollow and ready, and you break a piece of flatbread from the round loaf on the shelf, the bread, a little dry but still soft inside, the flour dusting your fingers. When the stew is warm, you take the bowl to the low stool by the door, where you can sit and look out at the darkening sky, and you eat slowly, dipping the bread into the lentils and chewing each mouthful for a long time, the food simple and good and filling. A small dish of salt sits beside the bowl, and you dip a finger into it and touch the salt to your tongue, the sharp taste bright against the earthy stew, and you drink water from the jar, and you feel the tiredness in your body begin to soften into something gentler, a drowsy warmth that spreads from your stomach outward. When the bowl is empty, you rinse it with a little water and set it aside, and you sit for a while longer by the door, watching the sky where the stars are now thick and bright, a great scatter of light across the darkness, the river of the sky that mirrors the river of the earth. The breeze that began in the afternoon is still blowing, a soft, steady wind that comes from the north and carries the smell of the water and the reeds and the distant fields, and it moves over your skin like a cool hand, pleasant and soothing. You hear the sounds of the village settling down, a baby crying briefly and then quieting, a man laughing somewhere, the low murmur of voices behind a wall, and then the sounds fade and there is only the river and the breeze and the occasional bark of a dog. You rise from the stool and you cross the room to your sleeping mat, which is spread on the floor near the back wall, a thick mat of woven reeds with a linen sheet folded at one end and a small headrest of wood that is worn smooth from use. You lie down on your side, the mat firm and familiar beneath you, and you pull the linen sheet over your legs, the fabric light and cool. The door is still open, the reed mat tied up, and through it you can see a small rectangle of sky, the stars bright and steady, and you can hear the river murmuring in the distance, a sound that has been there for every night of your life, and that has become so woven into your sense of home that you cannot imagine sleep without it. The breeze comes through the doorway and moves across your face, and you close your eyes, feeling the weight of the day settling into you. Your body is tired in a way that is complete and satisfying, the tiredness of muscles that have been used gently and steadily, the tiredness of a mind that has been focused on a single simple task for many hours, and now that task is over and the tiredness can take you. You think of the day that has passed, not in any ordered way, but in fragments that drift through your mind like the dust motes in the afternoon light, the grey dawn and the walk to the granary, the first marks on the fresh papyrus, the sound of the emmer pouring into the pit, the barley dust pale in the sun, the noon reckoning under the portico, the water level at the measuring post, the breeze stirring the sycamore leaves, the hoopoe on the wall, the closing of the accounts. The thoughts come and go, loose and unconnected, and you do not try to hold on to them. You let them drift, the way the river drifts, the way the silt settles in still water. Your breathing slows and deepens, the rise and fall of your chest becoming as regular as the brushstrokes you made all day, a quiet rhythm that needs no attention. The sounds of the night blend together into a single soft hum. The river and the breeze and the distant insects and the creak of a palm frond somewhere outside, and you feel yourself beginning to let go of the day, the boundary between waking and sleep growing thin and blurred. Your thoughts become smoother, slower, less formed, until they are no longer thoughts at all, but simply sensations, the cool air on your face, the firm mat under your body, the dark quiet of the room. You are aware of the river one last time, the sound of it a gentle, constant presence, a sound that has been flowing since the beginning of the world and that will flow long after this night has passed, and then you are not aware of anything at all, the day fading into sleep like the last light fading from the sky. Your rest is deep and quiet as the silt that settles to the bottom of the Nile.